Montana Territory, 1878, on the deadly canyon road outside Blackwood. A schoolteacher's life was about to change forever. Step away from her, or your next breath will be your last. 5 masked outlaws froze as a mysterious gunslinger stepped from the rocks, his twin revolvers smoking after saving Josephine Vance from certain death. "Who are you?" Joe whispered, staring at the man who had just killed 5 men in seconds. "Someone you should stay away from." But the cold-hearted outlaw was the only person standing between her and the darkness waiting in Blackwood. Stay with us as we uncover the story of the teacher who changed a killer's heart and the gunslinger who found something worth protecting. The stagecoach hit a rut, and Josephine Vance grabbed the leather strap above her head. Her knuckles went white. Outside the window, Red Canyon walls blurred past, and the driver up top was hollering at the horses like the devil himself was chasing them. Maybe he was. She pressed her spine against the wooden seat and steadied her breath. 3 days on this coach. 3 days of dust in her teeth and the smell of other people's sweat and the constant, jarring reminder that she was moving further from everything she'd ever known. Boston felt like another lifetime. The brownstone, the parlor, the husband who smiled so perfectly in public and used his fists in private. She touched the bruise below her collarbone, still yellow at the edges. Good riddance. The mining town of Blackwood sat another 4 hours east, up through the canyon pass. She had a position waiting there. A schoolhouse. Children who needed teaching. That was enough. That was everything. Then the first shot rang out. Not a pop. A crack sharp and close. The kind that split the air open. The coach lurched sideways. Joe heard the driver scream. Then the screaming stopped. And that was worse. The horses went wild. The coach fishtailed across the dirt road, tilting so hard that Joe's satchel launched off the seat beside her and smashed into the opposite wall. She braced both arms against the frame and rode the chaos while the vehicle slammed back down onto 4 wheels and skidded to a grinding stop. Silence, then hoofbeats, many of them, circling out of the coach. A man's voice, muffled behind cloth. Hands where God can see them. Now, Joe looked out the window. 4 riders, maybe 5, all masked, dark bandanas pulled up over the nose, hats pushed low. The one doing the talking had a rifle leveled at the coach door. The others fanned out around the horses. Her stomach dropped. She thought about the ledger in her satchel, the little money she had, the letters of recommendation from her department chair that had taken 3 months to arrange. All of it useless if she was dead in a canyon ditch. She pushed the door open and stepped down. The dirt crunched under her boots. Hot afternoon light hit her full in the face, and she squinted against it, keeping her chin level. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her cower. The driver was slumped across the bench up top, motionless. Blood ran dark down the side panel. Joe's chest clenched. She looked away before the sight could knock the air from her lungs, because if she stopped now, she would not start again. There she is. The rider with the rifle nudged his horse closer. His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her feel like livestock at auction. "Fancy little thing. Where you headed?" "Schoolteacher." Her breath was shallow. "Blackwood." He laughed. The others laughed too. "Not today," he said. He swung down from the saddle. One of the others followed. They moved with the easy confidence of men who had done this before. Men who had never once been held accountable for it. The rifle stayed pointed at her. Joe did not move. She held herself very still and thought, with a cold, strange clarity, that if she survived this, she was going to teach every single child in Blackwood to read until the letters burned into their bones. Because illiteracy and ignorance were the soil that grew men like this. She thought that, and she believed it. And it kept her standing. Then a sound. One shot, a body dropped. She spun left. The rider who'd been circling near the rear of the coach was down in the dirt, and for a half-second, she didn't understand what had happened. Another crack. The man with the rifle jerked sideways, clutching his arm, losing his grip on the weapon. It clattered to the ground. He tried to reach for it with his other hand, and something hit him in the chest, and he went down and did not get up. 2 more shots. So fast they nearly sounded like one. 2 more men fell. The last rider hauled his horse around and spurred hard, heading for the canyon wall. And then there was one final shot from somewhere in the rocks above and to the right. The rider slumped forward over his horse's neck. The horse veered off the road and kept running with its dead passenger until they disappeared behind a boulder. Jo stood in the middle of the road, surrounded by bodies. Her ears were ringing. The air smelled of gunpowder, sharp and acrid. Cutting through the dust, she counted the fallen, almost involuntarily. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, including the ones she couldn't see anymore. 5 men in under 30 seconds. Movement up in the rocks. She tracked it. A man came down the canyon wall with the unhurried ease of someone taking a walk. He moved in a straight, deliberate line through the boulders, not scrambling, not rushing, like the footing didn't concern him, like gravity was more of a suggestion. He dropped the last 6 feet and landed in the dirt without stumbling. He was tall, lean through the middle but broad across the shoulders in a way that seemed engineered rather than accidental. He wore black from collar to boot. The hat was black too, pulled low over a face that was cut hard jaw like something rough-hewn, not finished. Stubble going on 3 or 4 days. A pair of revolvers at both hips, both still smoking. He did not look at her right away. He walked to the nearest body, crouched briefly, then stood and moved to the next. Methodical, checking each man, though it was clear from the stillness of the forms that checking was a formality. When he finished, he straightened and holstered both guns in one motion, almost too fast to follow. Then he looked at her. His eyes were pale under the hat's shadow, gray or close to it. The kind of eyes that didn't hold warmth exactly, but held something awareness, calculation, something quiet and very old. He didn't speak. There's a wounded man, Jo said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. The driver. The stranger glanced up at the bench. Back at her. He moved to the coach, climbed the wheel in 2 steps, and checked the driver with the same clinical efficiency he'd used on the dead men below. He pressed 2 fingers to the man's throat. Held there. Alive, he said. First word he'd spoken. His voice was lower than she expected, rough at the edges. Jo was already moving. Her satchel had spilled partly out when it hit the wall, and she found what she needed, clean linen, needle and thread wrapped in oilcloth, the small bottle of carbolic she'd packed, because she'd read enough medical texts to know frontier travel was not gentle. She tore 2 long strips from the cleanest edge of her petticoat without hesitating. The stranger watched her from the top of the coach. She could feel the weight of his attention as she climbed up and began assessing the wound. Entry wound, left shoulder, no exit. Bullet was still in there, deep, too deep for a roadside fix. But she could slow the bleeding. She could buy time. She worked quickly, applied pressure, tied the bandage firm. You know what you're doing, the stranger said. There was no admiration in it, just an observation, flat and factual. Yes, she said, I do. She tied off the last knot and looked up at him. Up close, he was even harder to read. There was no swagger, no threat left in his bearing, but there was no softness either. He was looking at the bandage. Something crossed his face too fast to name. Those men, she said. They were going to? She stopped, restarted. You killed 5 men. I did, just like that. Just like that. She looked at the bodies in the road, at the blood soaking black into the red dirt, at the flies already beginning to gather. She thought about justice, about proportionality, about what it meant to take a human life, even a life in the process of destroying others. She felt the weight of it somewhere behind her sternum, heavy and unresolved. You don't feel anything, she said, do you? It was barely a question. The stranger looked at her then, held her gaze for a moment that stretched. Those pale eyes didn't flinch and didn't explain themselves. Feeling things, he said quietly, gets people killed. He climbed down from the coach. He caught the reins of the nearest horse, one of the attacker's mounts, standing loose and spooked, and led it around with practiced ease. Blackwood's 4 hours, he said. Stay behind me. He swung into the saddle. Jo looked at the road ahead, at the man on the horse, already moving. not looking back to see if she followed, at the dead men in the dust, and the wounded man breathing shallow above her, and the sun dropping toward the canyon rim. She climbed back into the driver's bench, gathered the reins. Her hands were steady. She didn't like him. She didn't like what he represented, violence, as the only language this land seemed to understand. The gun as the final argument in every disagreement. She believed, truly and without reservation, that there was another way to build a world, a better one, built on books and reasoning, and the radical idea that every child born into this wilderness deserved dignity. But the man who just killed 5 people in 30 seconds was the only reason she was still alive to believe any of that. She clicked the horses forward, 4 hours to Blackwood. Blackwood was not what she had imagined. She'd pictured something small and raw, the way frontier towns always looked in the illustrations she'd seen back east, rough-hewn lumber. Mud streets, men with hard faces and harder hands. She got all of that, but she hadn't pictured the weight of the place. The heaviness that sat over it like a second sky. Men moved through the main street with their eyes down. Women hustled children inside when they heard hoofbeats. Even the dogs stayed close to the walls. Joe noticed all of it on the ride in. She filed it away. The stranger she still didn't know. His name had delivered her to the edge of town with the same wordless efficiency he'd shown at the ambush site. He'd flagged down 2 men near the livery and pointed at the stagecoach roof, where the driver was bound tight and barely conscious. The men had jumped without asking questions, and Joe had realized then that whoever this man was, people here knew him, or knew enough about him to not require explanation. He'd turned his horse without a word to her and disappeared down a side road. She'd watched him go, then she'd picked up her satchel and walked into Blackwood alone. The schoolhouse came together in 11 days. The town didn't have one that was the first thing she confirmed. The children of Blackwood were either working in the mines by age 9 or sitting idle, and neither option sat right with Joe for longer than 5 minutes. She found the abandoned barn on the east edge of town through a woman named Cora, who ran the boarding house where Joe had taken a room. Cora was a big-armed, plain-spoken woman who had outlived 2 husbands and a flood, and seemed surprised by very little. "You want to use old Hicks's barn," Cora had said, setting down a coffee cup. "I want to turn it into a classroom," Joe said. Cora had looked at her for a long moment. Then she'd refilled the coffee. "I'll send my boy to help you with the roof." Joe fixed the south wall herself, with salvaged boards and a hammer she'd borrowed from the smithy. She wrote to the district board 3 times requesting desks and received no reply. So she had the miners' wives help her plane down long planks and nail them across sawhorses. Not elegant, functional. She hung a piece of painted black tin at the front and chalked the alphabet across it in big, clean letters, uppercase and lowercase both, with the corresponding phonetic sounds marked below. On the first morning, 7 children showed up. By the second week, there were 19. They came from every stratum of Blackwood's frayed social order. The Garza children, 4 of them, dark-eyed and sharp, whose father worked deep in the mine shafts. A girl named Nora, whose mother was Shoshone and whose father had abandoned them the previous winter. Twin brothers, sons of a Welsh miner, who arrived every morning, covered in coal dust, and left every afternoon slightly less so. A handful of white children from the more established families, most of whom had been kept home from school by parents who worried about mixing. Those parents came around by the 3rd week. Children have a way of going home and reporting what they've learned, and Joe made sure what they learned was extraordinary. She taught them to read by starting with things they already knew. Names. The names of the mountains they could see from the schoolhouse door. The names of the rivers. The names of the plants their grandmothers had taught them. She wrote those words on the black tin and watched the children's faces when they recognized that something they knew had a written shape, a form that could be shared and preserved and sent across a continent in a letter. That look, recognition, wonder, the sudden understanding that language was a form of power they could hold. That was the reason she'd come here. She also taught arithmetic by way of the mineshaft ledgers. with the miner's permission, showing the children how to cross-check the company's numbers against what their fathers were actually owed. Two of the older boys brought the calculations home and showed their fathers. One father had wept. She was teaching fractions using a broken wheel rim when Sheriff Boone arrived. She heard the horse first, then the creak of the barn door, pushed wider than necessary, then boots on the dirt floor, slow and deliberate. Judd Boone was a big man, not just tall, expansive. The way a threat is expansive, taking up more space than a body should. He had a lawman's star on his chest and a lawman's face. If the law had been left out in the sun too long and gone mean, he was maybe 50. Hard jaw, small eyes. The skin around them deeply creased from years of squinting at things he wanted to destroy. He stood at the back of the barn and looked at the children. The children looked back. Joe set down the chalk. Sheriff Boone. She'd been in town 3 weeks. She'd done her research. What can I do for you? You can close this down. He moved up the center aisle between the plank benches. The children pressed against each other. The Garza girl, 11 years old. The bravest one put her chin up and stared at him. Joe made note of that. On what grounds? Joe said. On the grounds that this is an unregistered educational establishment operating without county approval. He stopped in front of the black tin and looked at the alphabet written there as if the letters personally offended him. I've filed for registration, Joe said, 3 times. I've received no response. That's your answer. She folded her hands in front of her. She thought about the miner's ledgers. She thought about Nora, who had learned to write her own name 4 days ago and had cried, very quietly, facing the wall so no one would see. She thought about what this classroom represented to every family who'd sent a child through that door. These children have a right to education, she said. Her voice was even. That right doesn't require your approval or mine. It exists regardless of what any county clerk puts in a ledger. Boone turned from the blackboard. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the alphabet, like something that should be erased. Ma'am, he said, you are a long way from home, and you are making enemies you can't afford. He walked to the nearest plank desk and shoved it. It toppled over, and the books on top of it scattered across the dirt floor. A boy named Tomas flinched backward. The Garza girl grabbed his arm. Joe stepped in front of her students. She did not raise her voice. She did not back up an inch. Get out of my school, she said. Boone's hand moved to the revolver at his hip. Not drawing, just resting. A reminder of what conversation looked like out here when the talking was done. The shadow appeared in the barn door before the footsteps did. Joe saw Boone notice it, saw his eyes track left, and saw something change in the set of his shoulders, a tightening, an adjustment, the way a man recalibrates when the odds shift. Cale Cross leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and said absolutely nothing. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, filling the doorway with that particular stillness he carried everywhere. And the temperature in the barn seemed to drop 10 degrees. The two men looked at each other. Joe watched the calculation happen behind Boone's eyes. She watched him weigh it, and she watched him decide, slowly, that whatever this moment was worth, it wasn't worth it today. He straightened, put his hat back on. This isn't over, he said to Joe. I know, she said. He walked out. He had to pass directly by Cale to do it. Close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Cale didn't move. Boone angled around him by half a step, and that half step said everything that needed saying. When the hoofbeats faded, Joe turned back to her students. Every one of them was watching her. 19 faces, ranging from 7 to 14 years old, all holding their breath. Right, she said. She picked up the toppled desk herself, set it back on its legs, stacked the scattered books neatly on top. We were doing fractions. Tomas, come up here and finish the problem. Tomas stared at her for a moment. Then he got up. Cale was still in the doorway. She glanced at him once. He was watching the classroom, not her watching the children settle back to work, watching Tomas take the chalk and stand at the board. His expression was unreadable, but he stayed until she dismissed the class. Outside, after the children had gone, she found him leaning against the barn wall. Your ideals, he said, We'll get you killed. She picked up her satchel, adjusted the strap. All men are created equal, she said. My books will prove your bullets wrong. He looked at her. That pale gray gaze that didn't explain itself. Boone doesn't read books, he said. No, she agreed, but his children will, and theirs will. And eventually, a man like Boone will find himself in a world where he can't breathe. She paused. I can wait. He said nothing to that. She walked away first. She found out his name through Cora, Kellen Cross, called Cale, former outlaw, which explained the way Boone had moved around him. Former member of the Harrow Gang out of Nevada, which explained the look in his eyes. The Harrow Gang had a reputation. She'd heard of them, even in Boston newspapers, described them as the most brutal collection of killers the frontier had produced in a generation. There had been a massacre, a small town, somewhere in the Nevada desert. 14 dead, including women and children. She started. Wasn't there, Cora said. Word is he'd already cut loose by then, split from the gang a month before. But he lived with those men for 8 years, so you decide what that's worth. She poured whiskey into her own glass. Not Joe's, what I know is, since he showed up in Blackwood 6 months ago. 3 men who used to beat their wives have stopped doing it. Draw your own conclusions. Joe drew them. She didn't like them. She filed them away anyway. The fire started at 2 in the morning. Joe smelled at first that particular quality of smoke that comes with panic, the kind that carries the distinct scent of someone's home burning. She was out of bed and at her window in seconds. The miners' camp sat a quarter-mile east of the boarding house, and the sky above it was orange. She was running before she'd finished tying her boots. By the time she reached the camp, 3 of the low wooden structures were fully engulfed. Families were stumbling out into the dark, children in arms, women in nightgowns, men shouting at each other in Welsh and Spanish, and the Shoshone dialect she was only beginning to learn. The heat was tremendous. It pushed against her chest like a physical hand. She looked for Nora. The girl was there, by the water trough, her mother's arm around her. Joe's lungs unclenched. Is everyone out? She called to anyone who'd answer. Prentice family, a miner named Hector shouted back. He was pointing at the far structure, the one whose doorway was now solid flame. 3 kids. The wife Joe was already moving toward it when something large moved past her. Fast. Faster than a man that size should move. Cale hit the burning doorframe at a dead run and went through it. No hesitation. No pause. He was simply there. And then he was inside. Joe stopped. The heat forced everyone back. She shielded her eyes and watched the door and counted the seconds. 12. 13. A child came through first thrown. Really. Launched out through a side window that Cale must have broken from the inside. A miner caught the child without quite meaning to, by pure reflex. Then another child through the same window. Then the wife, helped out, and 2 more children. 22 seconds. The door blew outward with a crack like a rifle shot, and Cale came through it with a child under each arm and his back on fire. 2 men from the crowd hit him with a horse blanket before he'd taken 3 steps. He went down on one knee. The child in his right arm was crying. The one in his left was unconscious but breathing. He set them both down with a strange, careful gentleness and stayed on one knee while someone smothered the last of the flames on his back. Then he stood up and walked 10 feet away from the crowd and sat down hard against a fence post. Joe was already moving to him. The back of his shirt was burned through in patches, and the wound underneath was bad enough seared skin, blistering. But as she knelt beside him and pulled the ruined fabric aside, she saw something that stopped her cold. The burn was the least of it. Under the damage from tonight, older damage covered his back in long, raised ridges, silver white in the firelight. They ran diagonally, overlapping in some places, too regular in their spacing to be anything but deliberate. She counted without meaning to. Stopped at 12. Kept going. She'd read about flogging, medical texts, historical records, the accounts of formerly enslaved people that she'd studied in her own academic work. She knew what a whip scar looked like in theory. She'd never seen a back that had been unmade and remade this thoroughly. He turned his head and found her staring. She didn't look away. She didn't arrange her face into the careful blank of pity. She looked at him directly. "Can you walk?" she said. "A beat." "Yeah," he said. "Then we're going to the boarding house. I have carbolic and clean linen." She stood. "Come on." He came. He collapsed on her porch. Not all the way. He caught himself on the railing and went down slow, controlled. One knee, then both. Then sideways against the boards. But his eyes were wrong. Glassy and tracking something Joe couldn't see. She got under his arm, and he was heavier than she'd expected, dense with muscle, and whatever it was that men like him carried instead of rest. She got him inside. She got him onto the cot in the back room she used for storage. Cora appeared in the doorway, looked at the situation, and disappeared. She came back with hot water and didn't ask a single question. Joe worked for 2 hours. The burns were serious but treatable. The old scars were not her concern tonight. They were long past treating, long past anything except acknowledgement. She cleaned and dressed the new damage, piece by piece, methodical and thorough. Somewhere in the second hour, he went somewhere else. Not sleep. His body stayed rigid. Braced his hands, finding the edge of the cot and gripping. He spoke or tried to disjointed words. Names she didn't know. Fragments of sentences. "Raylan, don't. The water," I said I'd. He flinched away from her hands once, violently, and she held very still until the flinch passed. "You're on a cot," she said quietly. "In a room. The fire's out." His breathing stayed ragged. She did something she couldn't entirely explain. She put one hand on the uninjured side of his back, between the shoulder blades, and held it there, still, warm, saying nothing. His breathing slowed, slightly, then more. She stayed until it did. He was conscious by morning, fever-warm but lucid, or close to it. She brought him broth, and he ate it sitting up, which she counted as a good sign. He looked around the room with the careful eyes of someone mapping an exit. Then he looked at her. "You dug a bullet out of a driver 2 weeks ago," he said. "Now this. I was a teacher in Boston," she said. "I cross-trained in nursing for 2 years. Frontier postings require it." She pulled up the chair by the cot and sat. "You could have waited for someone to bring a ladder or a long rope. Kids were in there, so you ran into a burning building." He looked at the wall. "People do that," he said. She looked at his hands, burned along the outer edges, wrapped now in clean linen. She thought about the revolvers he'd fired at the ambush site, the speed and precision of it. And then she thought about those same hands launching children through a broken window. "The scars on your back," she said. He went very still. She wasn't going to pretend she hadn't seen them. That seemed to her a worse kind of cruelty. The deliberate social blindness that required a person to perform as if they had not suffered. "Whoever did that," she said, "did it more than once." He looked at her. His face was controlled, but the effort was visible, faint in the line of his jaw. "Gang discipline," he said. She waited. "When you ride with men like that, you don't always get to pick what you're part of." He stopped, started differently. "There was a job I wouldn't do. A farmhouse, family inside. Another stop. They disagreed with my position." Joe thought about that. About a 25-year-old man, or however old, he'd been refusing to participate in something monstrous and paying for it with his back. She thought about what that cost, not just physically, and what it meant about who he'd been even then. Beneath everything, the gang had tried to build on top of him. "And after," she said, "after. I stayed 2 more years." He said it flatly, like a charge he was reading against himself. "That's the part you're probably calculating right now." "I'm calculating what it takes," she said, "to leave the only world you know." He looked at her. The flat expression shifted, very slightly. "Longer than it should," he said. She nodded once. "That's true for most people." Outside, Blackwood was waking up. She could hear the distant shout of mine workers heading to shift, the clang of the smithy starting early, the ordinary noise of a town trying to hold itself together under weight it shouldn't have to carry. He was watching her. "Why Blackwood?" he said. It was the first question he'd asked her about herself. "You had a position in Boston." "I had a life in Boston," she said. "There's a distinction." She smoothed the front of her apron. "A classroom is a classroom, but this one is needed. Needed things get burned down." "Yes, she said. That's why they're needed. He was quiet for a while. She stood to go check on the dressing, and he spoke again without looking at her. Kale, he said, since you haven't asked. She paused. Joe, she said. He nodded once, very slightly, and looked back at the wall. She changed the dressing and left him to sleep. But she thought about that, the offering of a name, from a man who seemed to give very little voluntarily for the rest of the morning. It sat with her the way significant things sit. Not light, exactly. More like evidence. The first well went bad on a Tuesday. Joe heard about it at the schoolhouse. Tomas didn't come in the morning, and she thought nothing of it until the Garza children arrived, and the oldest one. A girl named Pilar told her that Tomas's mother was sick, stomach cramps, vomiting. Half the family, in fact, since Sunday. What are they drinking from? Joe asked. Pilar thought about it. The East Well. Joe dismissed the class an hour early. By Thursday, the East Well had made 17 people ill. By Friday, it was 32. And it wasn't just the East Well anymore. The symptoms were too specific: nausea, abdominal cramping, a particular yellowing around the eyes that Joe recognized from a medical text she wished she hadn't memorized so well. This was not natural contamination. She brought it to Cora first, because Cora knew everything. This has happened before, Cora said, 3 years back, in a mining town north of here called Garnet. Drove the population out in 6 months. Thorne bought the land for 12 cents on the dollar. She said this, the way she said most things plainly, without drama, like it was just information, and what you did with it was your own business. Joe did the arithmetic in her head. She did it fast. He's poisoning the water supply, she said. That's a serious accusation, Cora said. Yes, Joe said. It is. She went to find Cale. He was at the north edge of town, near a paddock where a few horses grazed. He'd been out of the boarding house for 4 days, moving stiffly but moving. She'd seen him from a distance twice. She hadn't sought him out. Now she walked up beside him at the fence line and started talking without preamble, because she'd learned he preferred it that way. She told him what she'd found, all of it, the timeline of illness, the geographic spread, the precedent in Garnet, the math on Thorne's water loan operation. She laid it out in sequence, clean and organized, the way she laid out a lesson plan. He listened without interrupting. We need evidence, she said when she'd finished. Something concrete, enough to bring to the federal office in Red Rock. Evidence won't stop a man with Boone's department behind him, he said. It will stop a federal marshal. He looked at her sideways. You trust the government. I trust the law, she said. They're not always the same thing, but the structures exist for a reason. You build something better by working through them, not around them. He turned back to the horses. I need to know how to shoot, she said. He turned back to her. She met his gaze. I'm not asking to kill anyone, she said. I'm asking to protect my students and myself. There's a difference, and I'm aware of it. But I'm not interested in being dependent on your presence every time Boone decides to make a point. She paused. Will you teach me or not? He studied her for a long moment. Then he pushed off the fence. Come on, he said. He took her out behind the old mill, where the canyon wall created a natural barrier, and a row of fence posts stood in varying stages of rot and lean. He started from the beginning, which she hadn't expected. She'd thought he'd hand her the gun and correct her grip. Instead, he stood back and told her to hold her hands out. She did. He looked at them. Right-handed, he said. Yes, strong wrists. He said it as an assessment, not a compliment. Good. Small caliber to start. Less recoil. Easier to manage the fundamentals before you're fighting the gun. He held out a revolver, shorter barreled than the ones at his hips. The grip worn smooth. Take it. She took it. Heavier than she'd expected. Unloaded, he said. First lesson has nothing to do with bullets. He spent 40 minutes on stance and grip. She wanted to rush past it. She didn't. She'd seen enough in teaching to know that fundamentals either held you up or let you down. And the student who skipped the foundation always came back to it eventually. So she listened. She adjusted when he corrected her. She asked questions. He seemed surprised by the questions. He answered them anyway. Why does the thumb placement matter? She asked. Slide comes back when it fires. Thumb in the wrong place. You lose skin. Gun jams. You're dead. And the elbow slightly bent. Not locked. Locked joint absorbs impact wrong. Bent the arm gives. You stay accurate. She nodded. Filed it. That's essentially the same principle as an impact absorber in engineering. He looked at her. Thought you were a teacher, he said. I teach everything, she said. He loaded the revolver. He stood close behind her to adjust her grip, one hand over hers, repositioning her fingers with a precision that was entirely practical and somehow still not comfortable to have. He smelled like wood smoke and leather and something else she couldn't name, something mineral, like stone in the sun, and he was close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him, which was irritating to notice and impossible not to. She focused on the fence post. She let the rest of it exist without responding to it. Line the front sight with the rear notch, he said, very close to her ear. Don't look at the target. Look at the front sight. The target blurs. That's correct. Counterintuitive, she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. Most things that work are, he said. She pulled the trigger. The recoil surprised her, less than she'd expected. The round caught the top of the fence post and spun it. She lowered the gun. Her pulse was loud in her ears, which was partly the shot and partly something she wasn't going to examine in the middle of a shooting lesson in a canyon. Again, Cale said. He stepped back, giving her room. Same process. She raised the gun. She fired 6 times. 3 hit the post. 1 went wide left. 2 took off the top third of it entirely. Cale took the empty revolver when she offered it back. He checked the cylinder, closed it. Decent, he said. For a first lesson. For anyone. He slid the gun into his belt. Coachable. Most people aren't. Coming from him. She suspected that was considerable praise. She dusted off her hands. The poisoned wells, she said, returning to it, because the lesson mattered. But the crisis mattered more. If Thorne is operating the way I think he is, there will be a paper trail. He'll have documentation loans issued, property transfers, something. Men like that keep records because they believe they're untouchable. They usually are, Cale said, until they aren't. She turned to look at the canyon wall, thinking. He has an office in the rail company building on 2nd Street. That ledger exists. I'm certain of it. Cale was quiet. You're planning something, he said. There was no alarm in it, just an accurate observation. I'm gathering information, she said carefully, after which I intend to plan something. He picked up a stone from the ground and turned it in his hand, set it on top of the nearest fence post. Then he stepped back and looked at her. You want to take the shot, he said. She looked at the stone, raised the revolver. He'd reloaded it while she wasn't paying attention. Quietly, efficient as everything else he did. She lined up the front sight, let the stone blur at the edge of her focus. She thought about Tomas, who hadn't come to school. She thought about his mother, sick from water that should have been clean. She thought about 32 people and a system designed to grind them down until they had nothing left to sell except themselves. She pulled the trigger. The stone vanished. She lowered the gun, handed it back. Yes, she said, I want to take the shot. He looked at her for a moment. Then, barely, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to it. Something that seemed almost involuntary. Like a reflex he'd tried to train out of himself and hadn't quite managed. Tomorrow morning, he said. We'll go over movement and cover. She nodded. She started back to town. Joe, he said. She stopped. He never used her name. She'd noticed that. She turned. The thing about the law, he said. You're right that the structures exist for a reason, but structures can be used against you. Keep the ledger separate from the legal filing once you have it. Don't give anyone a single piece with everything on it. She blinked. That's basic, he said, but people forget it when they're angry. He turned back toward the fence posts. And you get angry. She wanted to argue that. She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said, I do. She walked back to town with the smell of gunpowder still on her hands and the sound of his voice still in her ear, giving her information she needed in the only way he seemed to know how to give anything quietly, plainly, without making a performance of the giving. She thought that was its own kind of teaching. She filed that away, too. Elias Drum was 43 years old, had worked the Blackwood mine for 11 years, and had never once missed a shift. Joe knew this because he'd told her. He'd come by the schoolhouse 2 weeks prior, hat in hand, asking if she'd teach the strike pamphlet to the other miners. Not read it to them. Teach them to read it themselves. A man ought to understand what he's signing his name to, he'd said. She'd started the adult literacy session the following evening. 8 men, crowded around the plank desks built for children, bent over paper, with their big hands wrapped around pencils, too small for them. Elias had learned fastest. He'd gone home each night and taught his wife. She was thinking about that on Saturday morning when she heard the shot. One shot. Not a volley, not a fight. Just one clean crack from the direction of Main Street. The sound a rifle makes when the shooter isn't in a hurry. She ran anyway, instinct. The crowd had already gathered by the time she reached Main Street, pressing in a tight, stunned circle. She pushed through. She already knew what she would find. She knew it before she saw him, from the silence of the crowd, from the specific quality of the stillness, not shock exactly, but the particular hush that descends when something crosses from wrong into irreversible. Elias was on the ground near the water trough, on his back, arms loose, the strike pamphlet still rolled in one hand. He'd been shot through the chest. His eyes were open, and they weren't looking at anything anymore. Joe stood over him for a long moment. She thought about the way he'd held that pencil, about the pamphlet in his hand pages he'd been able to read. Finally, because someone had sat across a plank desk from him and taught him how. She thought about his wife, learning at home by lamplight. She did not cry. She made herself a promise instead. Sheriff Boone arrived 7 minutes later. He walked through the crowd, crouched over the body with a performance of professional assessment, and stood back up. "Drifter," he announced. "Probably robbed him. Move along." No one moved. "There's nothing here," Boone said, louder. His eyes swept the crowd and landed on Joe. "Stayed there. Move along." People moved, not because they believed him, because they were afraid. And because fear is rational when you're living under a gun and a badge that belong to the same man. Joe did not move until Boone's eyes broke from hers first. He did. She turned and walked to the boarding house and found Cale in the back room, sharpening a knife with methodical, rhythmic strokes. She closed the door behind her. "Elias Drum is dead," she said. "Shot on Main Street in daylight." Boone called it a robbery. Cale's hands stopped. "We need Thorne's office," she said. "Now. Tonight. Whatever documentation exists in that building. We need it before he realizes that Elias's death just made this a war and moves it somewhere we can't reach." Cale set down the knife. "You understand what tonight means," he said. "We get caught in there. Boone has legal cause to lock us both up. Legal cause is the only kind he's been waiting for." "I understand that," she said. "And you want to go anyway." "I want to go because of it," she said, "not in spite of it." He looked at her for a moment. Whatever he was calculating. He calculated it fast. "Tonight," he said. 2 hours past midnight. Come dark and quiet. The rail company building on 2nd Street was 2 stories of dressed timber and iron fittings, newer than everything around it. Thorne had imported the materials from the east, which told you something about the man the contempt embedded in building a monument to yourself in the middle of a town you were actively dismantling. They went in through the back. Cale dealt with the lock-in under a minute, using a tension tool and a pick so small it vanished between his fingers. And Joe filed away the knowledge that this was not his first time doing this, and the knowledge did not particularly disturb her. Inside, the building smelled fresh pine and lamp oil. They moved by feel in the dark. No. Lantern until they reached the inner office with the shuttered windows. And even then, Cale shielded the flame with his hand until he'd checked the gaps. The office was well ordered. Thorne was meticulous. She'd expected that. Men who ran criminal operations through paper did so because they understood that chaos left evidence and order could be controlled. The desk had 4 drawers on either side, locked. The filing cabinet in the corner was not. "Start there," Cale said quietly. He moved to the desk. Joe went to the cabinet. She worked the way She worked through any research systematically, left to right, reading headings before pulling files, returning each one precisely to its position. The top two drawers were ordinary: survey records, equipment invoices, staff payroll. The third drawer was different. It held a single ledger, thick, bound in dark leather, the cover unmarked. She opened it at the front page. The entries ran in columns: dates, amounts, location names. She recognized Garnet immediately, the northern town Cora had mentioned. Beneath it, two other names she didn't know, and then Blackwood, starting 8 months prior. She followed the Blackwood column, expenditures on what was labeled geological treatment at regular intervals. But the sums were too small for actual mining chemistry, and too large for anything legitimate at that scale. She turned to the back section, a different handwriting, cramped and fast, annotating the columns and margins. Wells 3 and 4. Sulfate compound introduced 914. Symptoms expected within 72 hours. Loan officer notified. She read it twice. Then she pulled the next sheet beneath it. A contract, drafted but not yet executed. It was a labor agreement, no. That wasn't the right word. The language was elaborate, layered in legal phrasing designed to sound like an employment contract. But the terms ran for 25 years. The workers could not terminate without paying penalties that exceeded anything they would ever earn. And the collateral clause required them to sign over property rights to any land claim registered in their names. It was not a contract. It was a deed of enslavement with a lawyer's signature on the bottom. She heard herself exhale. "Cale," she said. He was already at her shoulder. She hadn't heard him move. He read the ledger page, and then the contract in silence. "There are more," she said, rifling carefully. "At least 4 copies of the contract template. And here," she pulled another sheet of letter to a federal land assessor. "He's already filed the paperwork to claim the mine titles once the families default." "How long?" Cale said. She did the math. 6 weeks, maybe 8. She was photographing it in her memory, every column, every annotation, every name on every page. She'd been trained to read quickly and retain precisely. It was the foundation of good teaching, and it served her now. She carefully folded 2 sheets, the annotated well entry, and a signed copy of the contract, and placed them inside her coat. The ledger she replaced exactly as she'd found it. The rest she left precisely in order. Cale read her face. "You're leaving the ledger," he said. "If we take it, he knows we were here. If we leave it, we have copies, and he doesn't know we have them. He keeps operating as if he's untouchable." She smoothed the cabinet drawer shut. "And we have time to get the documents to Red Rock before he realizes the trap has closed." Cale looked at her. Then he nodded once. They moved back toward the hall. The guard came from the left. He came fast, with a lantern in one hand and a short-barreled shotgun in the other. And he was shouting before he'd even fully rounded the corner. Cale moved first. He went right, taking the guard's weapon hand at the wrist, controlling the barrel and stripping the shotgun before it discharged one motion, violent and efficient. 2 seconds. Then 2 more guards from the stairs. The lantern hit the floor, but didn't break. In its rolling light, the hallway turned into a geometry of shadows and quick movement. Jo pressed herself to the wall and watched Cale work through the problem with the same methodical quality she'd seen at the canyon. He was not performing. He was solving. A shot went off too close. She felt the air move near her ear. "Door," Cale said. She was already at it. They came out into the alley at a run. More shouts behind them. More boots on wood. Cale's hand found her arm and redirected her left, then left again, through a gap between buildings she'd never have found in the dark. He moved through Blackwood's back passages the way she moved through a lesson, like he'd been through it enough times that he didn't need to think about the path. 3 minutes. They emerged behind the livery, breathing hard. He checked her first. His eyes swept her face, her coat, her hands, looking for blood. She understood this, and it struck her as significant that his first calculation, after getting them clear, was her. "I'm fine," she said. He dropped his hand. "Documents? Safe." She pressed her coat to her chest. "Safe." He nodded. His jaw was set, and his breathing was measured and coming down fast, the way a man's breathing comes down when violence is not new to him. She knew this now. She'd accepted it. She pulled the folded sheets from her coat and looked at them in the thin moonlight. Elias Drum's name wasn't in these documents, but the system that had killed him was. The machinery that had needed him quiet was laid out here in columns and contract language, tidy and damning. "We need a courier," she said. "Someone Boone doesn't know. Someone who can ride to Red Rock and not be stopped." Cale was already thinking. "Cora's nephew," he said. "He runs supply wagons. Boone's people don't flag supply wagons. How fast can he ride?" "Fast enough." Joe folded the documents back inside her coat. "Then tomorrow," she said. "First light." She looked up at the sky, wide and black and burning with stars. She thought about Elias, who had believed that words on paper were worth something, who had died holding them. She thought about 18 children in a barn schoolhouse, learning to read their own names. She thought, "I will not waste this." The rain came that same night and didn't stop. By dawn it was a proper storm, low and gray and biblical, sheeting in from the northwest with a wind that pushed it sideways. The streets of Blackwood turned to mud. The mine operations halted. Everything that could take cover did. Joe and Cale were 3 miles outside of town when it hit. They'd gone out early to intercept Cora's nephew, Denny, at the supply road before Boone's morning patrol could. Denny had the documents now sewn into the lining of his coat, which had been Joe's idea. He was on his way to Red Rock with a cover story about flour and lamp oil, and he knew exactly which office to walk into and who to hand the sealed envelope to. Joe had written the accompanying letter herself and chosen every word with surgical care. It was done, as much as it could be done. For now, the problem was getting back. The storm closed the canyon pass in under an hour. The road back to Blackwood ran along the base of the eastern ridge, and the ridge above it was already shedding water in sheets, cutting channels across the path where channels hadn't been before. Cale pulled his horse up at the edge of a fast-moving stream that had been a dry gulch that morning. He looked at it, looked at the ridge, looked at the sky. "Canyon pass is closed," he said. "I can see that," Joe said. He turned his horse and headed north along the ridge line without further discussion. She followed. She'd learned by now that when Cale moved with that particular decisiveness, he had a destination. She saved her questions for when they arrived. The cave was set into the rock face about 40 feet up from the canyon floor, accessed by a switchback track that the horses couldn't manage. They tied the animals in a shallow overhang below and climbed. And by the time they cleared the ledge and ducked inside, Joe was soaked through to the skin. The cave was narrow, 20 feet deep, maybe 12 feet wide at the widest point. The ceiling sloped in from the left, giving the right side more headroom. At the back, an old fire ring. Above it, a natural chimney through a crack in the rock. Someone had used this place before, more than once. Dry wood was stacked against the far wall under a rock shelf. Cale built the fire without ceremony. Joe wrung out her braid over the cave mouth and assessed the medical situation. His left side, she noted. He was holding it carefully. Not enough that anyone who wasn't watching would see, but she was watching. "You took a hit in the hallway," she said. He said, "Show me." A pause. Then he turned from the fire and pulled up the side of his shirt. Grazed was accurate, but not generous. The round had opened a 4-inch furrow across his ribs, shallow enough that his lung wasn't involved, deep enough that it was still bleeding steadily through the clotted edges. She'd seen worse. She'd also seen that worse had a way of becoming catastrophic when left unattended in damp conditions. She pulled off her outer jacket. The lining was dry enough. She tore 2 strips from the inside hem without asking his permission. "Sit," she said. He sat. She cleaned the wound with the last of the carbolic she'd started carrying in her coat pocket after the miners' campfire, a habit. Now the way this territory had made a series of habits of her, and he sat through the process without making a sound. The fire had caught fully and was pushing heat into the narrow space. Outside, the rain redoubled. Thunder rolled through the canyon, deep and sustained, and the hound calls she'd heard briefly before the storm swallowed them, were gone now. She pressed the cloth against his ribs and held pressure. He was looking at the fire. She was close enough to see the firelight working across the planes of his face, catching the lines around his eyes, the old scar that ran through the left corner of his lip, the gray that had started coming in at his temples. She'd been cataloging these things, without intending to. She'd been cataloging a lot of things. She should have been thinking about Red Rock, about Denny on the supply road, about the Federal Marshal Office, and whether the documents were enough. She was thinking about his hands on her arms in the hallway, redirecting her left, taking her weight in the pivot, without seeming to notice he was doing it. The automatic nature of it. She pressed harder on the cloth. Focus. Thorne will know it was us, she said. By tomorrow. By tonight, Cale said. Then Boone will come for us directly. Yes, she checked the cloth. The bleeding was slowing. Good. We should be frightened, she said. Not a question. You are, he said. You're just not letting it run you. She looked up at him. He was looking at her now, not the fire. Direct, as always. No layer of social gentleness to it. Is that what you do? She said. Let it frighten you and keep going anyway. I stopped being frightened a long time ago, he said. That's not actually better. She understood what he meant. Fear was information. It told you what you valued, what you stood to lose. A man who'd stopped feeling afraid had usually stopped having things he cared about losing. Her hand was still against his ribs, the cloth between her palm and his skin. She could feel him breathing. She thought about her marriage, about what 6 years with a man who used fear as a management tool had done to her understanding of herself, about how long it had taken, after leaving, to stop flinching at the sound of a door closing too hard, about how she'd rebuilt herself piece by piece, book by book, principle by principle, until she'd arrived at something she trusted. She didn't talk about it with people, generally. It felt private in the way certain wounds feel private, not shameful, just not for general distribution. She talked about it now, not all of it, not the details, but enough. She talked while she finished dressing the wound, and the rain hammered the canyon outside, and the fire settled into a steady, generous heat. She talked about Boston, and the parlor, and the smile that worked in public. And she talked about the morning she'd packed a single trunk and left a note on the kitchen table that said, I am choosing my own life now. Do not look for me. Cale listened. He did not offer commentary or consolation. He just listened, which was rarer and more valuable than either. When she finished, the cave was warm, and the light was the deep amber of a fire doing serious work, and the storm had settled into something sustained rather than violent. The scars, he said, quietly, on your back. She was still for a moment. Not like yours, she said. Different instrument. He said nothing. He reached out slowly, slow enough that she could read the motion. Slow enough to say, this is not a demand, and his hand found hers, which was resting on her knee. He turned it over, looked at the palm. Her hands were not soft. Teaching in the East had given her ink stains. Teaching in Blackwood had given her calluses. He held her hand and looked at it, and did not say a word about it. Something in her sternum she stopped. That was exactly the kind of construction she'd trained herself against. The literary shorthand for emotions that deserved more precision than that. What happened was this. She looked at his face in the firelight, and she saw a man who had done damage and survived damage and was trying, badly, in the only idiom available to him, to be something better. And she saw that he was looking at her with a precise, specific attention that had nothing performative in it. She put her other hand over his. He looked up. She leaned forward and kissed him. Once, unhurried, asking something without words, because words were her instrument, and she set them down deliberately. He went very still. Then his free hand came up and cupped the back of her head, gentle in a way she hadn't expected, deliberate and careful and real. He kissed her back. When she pulled back to look at him, his eyes were dark, not cold, dark the way deep water is dark full, not empty. Joe, he said, low, just her name. But all the weight of everything they hadn't said sat inside it. She held his gaze. Her hands were trembling, and not from cold, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. I know who you've been. she said. I know what you've done. That's not what I'm looking at. What are you looking at? He said. Who you're becoming, she said. His jaw worked. Something moved through his expression, something old and difficult. A locked thing being asked to open. I don't know if that man is worth much, he said. I'm a teacher, she said. Determining what's worth something and what can still grow is my entire profession. He looked at her for a long moment. Then his hand moved from the back of her head to her jaw, tracing along her cheekbone with his thumb. Studying her face with that same methodical attention, he gave everything, as if he was committing her to memory. She reached up and traced the scar on his chest, the one that ran jagged from his collarbone halfway down. She traced it slowly, not with pity and not with delicacy, with the full, honest acknowledgement of what it was proof of survival. Evidence of a life that had been hard and was still being lived. He closed his eyes. She pressed her palm flat against his chest. His heartbeat was there, steady and fast. Go in slowly, she said quietly. Touch it. His eyes opened, dark, entirely focused, entirely present. I'll make it, he said, voice rough. All night, he pressed her back against the cave wall and kissed her again. And this time, there was nothing tentative about it. There was only the rain outside and the fire behind them, and the long, compressed weight of two wounded people finally releasing their grip on the past. The storm lasted until nearly dawn. They were still in the cave when it ended. Denny came back from Red Rock in 36 hours. He found Cale and Joe at the boarding house before sunrise, looking road-worn and very awake. He'd slept 4 hours in the saddle and eaten once in 2 days, and he had news. Marshall took the documents, he said, accepting coffee from Cora with both hands. Didn't say much. Read everything twice. Then he looked at me and said, how many civilians on the ground? He looked at Joe. I told him Blackwood's population. Best I could figure. He wrote it down. Did he give a timeline? Joe asked. Said a week, maybe less. Denny drank half the coffee in one pull. Also said, don't let anything burn before he gets there. Said evidence is harder to file on when it's ash. Joe nodded. Good. There's a problem, Denny said. He set down the cup. I came back through the South Canyon. Thorne's got a freight train loaded and scheduled for the mine tomorrow night. I asked the rail yard man what the cargo was, said mining supplies, but the manifest listed it wrong. Weight's off, way off, he looked at Cale. Too heavy for tools and timber. Cale had gone still, the way he went still when something clicked into place. Dynamite, he said. That'd be my guess, Denny said. Joe looked at Cale. He was already calculating. She could see it working in his eyes. The rapid inventory of problems and variables. The same thing she did when planning a lesson, except that the curriculum here was considerably more violent. He's going to detonate the mine tunnels, Joe said. The insurance claim was in the ledger. If the tunnels collapse, he files for the payout and walks away clean. The documents in Red Rock implicate him in the water poisoning. But a collapsed mine is physical evidence destroyed. He needs it gone before the marshal arrives. When does the train leave? Cale asked Denny. Midnight tomorrow. Cale stood, rolled his shoulders once, reached for his coat. Then we have 1 day, he said. They had no authority, no official standing, no legal mechanism to stop a freight train from leaving its own rail yard. Joe knew this. She spent most of the daylight hours not wasting time on it. Instead, she spent the day preparing the town. She went to Hector, the miner who'd called Elias's name at the fire. She went to Pilar's father, Eduardo Garza. She went to 6 other men and 3 women she'd identified over the past weeks as the load-bearing members of Blackwood's social structure, the ones others looked to when looking was necessary. She told them what was coming, not all the details. Enough. The marshal is coming, she said, each time. We need the mine intact when he arrives, and we need everyone in this town to stay inside tomorrow night until the all clear. None of them asked how she knew. They'd watched Elias die in the street. They'd been drinking poisoned water. They were done asking for proof of things they'd lived through. Cale spent the day checking weapons and scouting the rail yard layout. He came back at dusk and spread a rough map on the boarding house table, drawn from memory, which meant it was accurate to the level of individual rail ties. Engine, coal car, 3 freight cars, a caboose, he said. The dynamite will be in the 2nd or 3rd freight car, not the 1st. Too exposed, not the caboose. Too far from exit if something goes wrong. Thorne will have 4 or 5 guards riding inside. Boone, Joe said. Not on the train, personally. He'll be in town as cover. If anything goes wrong, he needs to be able to say he knew nothing. Joe studied the map. What's the plan? Train picks up speed for the first quarter mile out of the yard, then slows through the canyon grade. There's a section where it'll be doing about 15 miles an hour. The roof access is there. He traced the line with his finger. We board on the move. She looked at the roof access marking on his map, then at him. I'm coming, she said. He didn't argue. He'd stopped arguing with her about this category of decision. She'd noticed that happening gradually, and she thought it represented a kind of earned respect. Or possibly he'd simply realized that arguing with her consumed energy he didn't have. You stay low on the roof until we reach the 2nd car, he said. Then you go in through the side access and cut the coupling to the 3rd freight car while I deal with the guards. Cut it with what? He put a bolt cutter on the table. She looked at it. Where did you get Smithy? He said, asked. She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. She'd be carrying it on her, back up a moving train in the middle of the night. If the 3rd car decouples, she said, thinking through it. It rolls back down the grade. The dynamite misses the mine by 4 miles, he said. Mostly open terrain. Controlled detonation risk, but survivable. Nothing we can do about that part. She nodded. Acceptable. They left at 11. The midnight sky was clear after the storm. The stars enormous, and the canyon walls bone-white in the moonlight. The rail yard was lit by 4 lanterns strung along the fence, and 2 guards walked a lazy circuit around the locomotive. They dealt with the guards the way you deal with problems that are simpler than they look patiently. Cale moved through the shadows with a gift for stillness that she'd come to think of as its own kind of intelligence. A spatial understanding of cover and timing that was as refined as any academic skill she'd encountered. The 2 guards separated on their circuit. When they did, Cale came out of the dark, and each one went down in sequence, quiet and efficient. She didn't watch the details. She watched the perimeter. Then they were at the moving train. It was louder than she'd expected. This close, the locomotive was already pulling hard, smoke rolling in a dense black column into the clear night. The roar was physical, something you felt in your teeth and your sternum. She slung the bolt cutter across her back and looked at the ladder on the rear of the coal car. Coming up fast, Cale said. She ran. Caught the ladder on the 3rd stride. The train tried to pull her arm out of its socket, and she let her legs run with it, and then she was on, ascending, and Cale was right behind her, on the roof. The wind was tremendous. The train was in the canyon now, walls rising on either side, the moonlight strobing through the rock formations. As they moved, she pressed low and moved hand over hand toward the 2nd car, feeling the roof flex slightly under each contact point, keeping her weight distributed. Cale passed her. He went for the car door below. She found the coupling between the 2nd and 3rd freight cars. The bolt cutter was unwieldy in the wind. She braced her feet against the roof ridge and positioned the jaws around the coupling pin. From inside the car below her, she heard shouting, then a shot, then 3 more. She cut the coupling. The pin gave on the 4th full squeeze, and the separation was physical and immediate, a lurch, a gap opening between the cars. The 3rd car slowing almost instantly as the engine pulled free. She grabbed the roof edge and rode the deceleration, scraping forward on her knees, not letting herself think about the drop on either side. Then she heard Cale, not his voice, the particular silence where his voice should have been. She dropped through the side access into the 2nd car. 2 guards were down. A 3rd was backed against the far wall with his gun raised. Cale was 5 feet from him, standing between her and the barrel, which told her he'd heard her come through and positioned accordingly. He had his own revolver leveled. A standoff, both of them with clear shots. Then she recognized the face on the 3rd man, Sheriff Judd Boone. Not in town as cover here. Boone looked at Cale across the freight car. The train was still moving. Slower now, the canyon grade working against the engine. Boxes of dynamite were stacked behind Boone in neat rows, crated and roped. Should have seen this coming, Boone said. Always knew you'd end up cleaning up after yourself. Put it down. Judd, Cale said. Steady. No heat in it. You put yours down, Boone said. Old times. Just you and me. We talk this out. There's nothing to talk out, Cale said. You made your choices. So did you, Boone said. You walked away from the gang and left us holding your reputation. You know what people said. Said you went soft. Said you weren't worth the trouble. He took a half step sideways. Maybe they were right. Cale's aim didn't waver. Joe stayed still. She watched Cale's profile, watched his finger on the trigger. The shot was there, clean, unobstructed, this close in a confined space. Boone knew it, and Cale knew it, and everyone in the car knew it. She watched Cale remember something. She couldn't have said exactly what she was seeing, but she saw it, some internal reference point, something that turned the calculation from one answer to another. His eyes had changed. He fired, not center mass. He shot Boone's gun hand, precise and brutal, and Boone's revolver hit the freight car floor. Boone screamed a short, shocked sound and grabbed his hand. Cale crossed the distance in 2 strides and kicked him sideways off the step platform and into the dark. The train slowed toward the grade's crest. Cale turned. His expression was entirely controlled. She saw what was underneath the control, the cost of that decision. The deliberate act of choosing something harder when the easier thing was right there. She crossed the car to him. She put her hand on his jaw and turned his face to hers. He looked at her. I remember your eyes, he said quietly, like she'd already known he would, like she'd already been there, in whatever internal moment had shifted his aim. I know, she said. The train coasted to a stop 300 yards from the mine entrance. The third car sat a dark shape far down the grade behind them, separated, still, inert. She looked at him in the freight car's shadow, her hand still against his face. His pulse was fast beneath her fingertips at his jaw, then slowing. Coming down, the canyon was quiet around them. The stars overhead were enormous. The mine entrance stood open in the distance, intact, waiting for the marshal who was already on the road. You broke the cycle, she said. He looked down at his hands, the one that had made the shot, the one that had made a different choice than he'd made 100 times before. First time for most things, he said. She laughed, quietly, because it was true and because she hadn't expected the humor of it in this moment, and the sound of it echoed slightly in the canyon and dispersed. He looked at her when she laughed, and he smiled, a real one, slow and crooked and entirely unexpected on his hard face, like something that had been waiting a long time for the right moment and had decided tonight was sufficient. She filed that away. She knew she would be filing it for a long time. The mine tunnel stood open and whole in the moonlight, and for about 4 minutes. That felt like a victory. Then the first rider came down off the ridge with a torch, and Joe understood that Thorne had never planned to lose quietly. They're coming for the town, Cale said. He was already moving, checking the load in his revolver, scanning the tree line above the grade. Not the mine, the town, many. Enough that he thinks it'll work. They ran. The 300 yards back to Blackwood felt longer than the whole night before it. Joe's lungs burned. The bolt cutter was still strapped across her back. Forgotten weight, she didn't have the breath to shed. Ahead of them, gunfire had already started. A ragged popping that rolled down the canyon and came apart into individual shots the closer they got. Thorne's men had come in from the south road, 8 or 9 of them by the muzzle flashes, riding hard through the middle of Main Street. Windows were breaking. Somewhere a woman was screaming a name, over and over. The boarding house had a lantern burning in one window and no light in any of the others, because Blackwood had listened to Joe's warning and gone dark. Gone still. Gone to ground the way she'd told them to. It didn't matter. The men weren't looking for resistance. They were looking to burn. Joe saw the first torch arc toward Cora's porch roof, and something in her chest went cold and very clear. She had spent her whole life believing that violence answered nothing. She still believed it. in the long run, in the world she wanted to build. But the long run required a town still standing to build it in. And right now, the only thing standing between Blackwood and Ash was a handful of armed men who did not care what she believed. Rifle, she said to Cale. Where's the rifle? He didn't ask which one. He'd hidden a lever action under the boarding house porch 2 days before. A precaution she hadn't questioned at the time. He pointed, and she ran for it, low, hugging the fence line, and came up with it in both just as Hector and 2 other miners broke from behind the smithy with shotguns they'd kept hidden since the day Boone first rode through the schoolhouse door. The fight that followed didn't look like the fights in the dime novels Joe had read as a girl, the ones with clean lines and clear heroes. It was chaos. It was people who had never fired at another human being, finding out what their hands would do when the choice came down to that, or watching their homes burn. It was miners' wives dragging children under porches. It was Eduardo Garza standing in his own doorway with an old army pistol, hands shaking, firing anyway. Joe found a position behind the horse trough and did the only thing she knew how to do under pressure, which was think. She counted riders. She tracked the ones circling toward the schoolhouse side of town. Because if Thorne's men understood anything about what mattered to her, they would go there first out of spite alone. She was right. 2 riders peeled off toward the barn, torches already lit. She raised the rifle and fired, and 1 man went down off his horse. She didn't have time to feel anything about that. There wasn't room for it. She worked the lever, sighted the 2nd man, and fired again. And he veered off before the shot landed, torch guttering out as he dropped it and reached for his gun instead. Across the street, Cale was a shape moving between muzzle flashes, methodical even now, taking cover where cover existed and making cover where it didn't. She watched him put down 2 more men with the same economical precision he'd shown at the ambush site the day they met. No wasted motion, no hesitation. She also watched him step wrong, once, favoring the side where Boone had shot him aboard the train. And she filed that away with a small, cold spike of worry she didn't have room for either. The gunfire thinned as Thorne's men realized the town was not the easy target they'd been promised. 2 more went down. 1 turned his horse and ran, and 3 others followed him. And for a moment, Joe thought it might actually be over. Then she saw the man on the roof of the assay office. He hadn't ridden in with the others. He'd been positioned there before the attack started, patient, waiting. A rifle braced against the parapet and aimed with the unhurried confidence of a man who did this for a living and didn't need chaos to work. Joe tracked the barrel and understood. In the half-second, it took her body to catch up with her eyes, exactly where it was pointed. Cale had stepped into the open to reload. His back was to the assay office. He hadn't seen the roof at all. There wasn't time to shout a warning that would matter. There wasn't time to run the 30 feet between them. There was only the rifle already in her hands and the front sight already half raised from the last shot. And Joe did not think about it as a decision, so much as an extension of everything she had learned in that canyon, behind the mill, standing with Cale's hand over hers, listening to him explain why the elbow stayed loose and the front sight mattered more than the target. She brought the rifle up. She found the front sight. She let the man on the roof blur at the edges the way Kyle had taught her. And she fired. The sniper's shot went wide and cracked into the dirt, a foot from Cale's boot, as the man toppled backward off the roof line and out of sight. For a moment, nobody moved. The street had gone quiet. The last of the raiders gone. Hoofbeats fading into the canyon. Somewhere a dog was barking at nothing. Smoke drifted from a porch someone had managed to douse before it caught. Joe lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking now that there was nothing left to aim at. Cale turned and saw her standing there with the rifle still smoking. And he understood immediately what had happened and what it had cost to make it happen. He crossed the street to her without a word. She looked past him at the roofline, empty now, and then down at her own hands. "I killed a man," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her, flat, like it belonged to someone standing a few feet away. "You saved one," Cale said. Both things happened at the same time. I understand that. I do. She was still looking at her hands. I've spent a year telling this town that we don't answer violence with violence. That the whole point of what we're building is that there's a better way. And the first time, it was you on that rooftop instead of some stranger. I didn't hesitate. Not for a second. No, he said. You didn't. What does that make me? He took the rifle from her hands, gently, and set it against the trough. Then he took both her hands in his, steadying them. The way she'd once steadied his on a cot in a back room, while a fever burned through him and a fire burned outside. It makes you someone who understands the difference between a principle and a person, he said. You still believe the principle. You just weren't willing to let it cost you the person. She looked up at him, around them. Blackwood was beginning to stir back to life, doors opening a crack, faces appearing in the dark. The slow accounting of who had survived. Hector was shouting for a wagon. Somewhere a child was crying, and then not crying. Comforted. I don't know how to hold both of those at once, Joe said. The teacher who believes in the law, and the woman who just shot a man off a roof without blinking. You don't have to know yet, Cale said. Tonight, you just have to be both, figuring out how they fit together. That comes after. She let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since the train. That's not very comforting, she said. No, he agreed. It's just true. She almost laughed, the sound catching somewhere between grief and relief. And he pulled her against his chest and held her there while the town put itself back together around them, board by board, breath by breath. She could feel his heart going fast under her cheek, faster than a man who'd just walked through a gunfight without a scratch had any business having it go. And she understood that some of that was for her, for what she'd done to keep him standing. Neither of them said anything else for a while. There wasn't anything that needed saying. The mine stood intact half a mile up the grade. The documents were 3 days gone toward Red Rock, and a federal marshal who wrote things down. Boone was somewhere out in the dark with a ruined gun hand, and Thorne was somewhere in his timber office counting losses he hadn't planned for. But the blood on Joe's hands was new, and it would stay new for a while, no matter how many people told her it had bought something worth having. She held on to that honestly, the way she held on to everything. She didn't pretend the cost wasn't real, just because the trade had been fair. 2 federal marshals rode into Blackwood at noon the next day, and Thorne was in shackles by 2 o'clock. It happened faster than Joe expected, and with less ceremony. He'd barricaded himself in the rail company office when word reached him that the mine still stood and his hired guns had scattered. But a man who has built his entire life on the assumption of impunity does not know how to behave once that assumption collapses. He surrendered when the marshals broke down the door. He was, by all accounts, still trying to negotiate terms when they put the irons on his wrists. Word spread through Blackwood before the marshals had finished, walking him out to the street. By the time they reached Main Street, half the town had gathered, and the mood was not relief. It was something harder, older, closer to the bone. Joe felt a change before she understood why. She was standing near the schoolhouse with a cluster of her students' parents when she heard the first voice call out for a rope. It didn't come from one person. It rippled through the crowd the way fire moves through dry grass, catching here and there until it was everywhere at once. Hector's voice, Eduardo Garza's, voices Joe recognized as belonging to people who had lost husbands, sons' wages, wells, and years of their lives to a system Thorne had built to bleed them slowly. Someone produced a length of rope. Someone else dragged a barrel under the crossbeam outside the mercantile. The marshals, 2 men against a town's worth of grief, hesitated. Joe watched one of them put a hand on his sidearm and understood, with a sinking clarity, that the situation could tip into something that would leave more than one body in the street before it was through. She thought about Elias Drum lying by the water trough with a pamphlet in his hand. She thought about 32 poisoned families, about the deed of enslavement she'd found in a locked drawer, about every reason this crowd had to want Thorne swinging from that beam within the hour. She thought about what Blackwood would be the morning after. If they did it, she started walking. Cale's hand found her arm as she passed him. "Joe, I know," she said. "They're not going to want to hear it. I know that too." She looked at him. "Doesn't change what needs saying." He let her go. She felt him fall in a few steps behind her, not stopping her, not leading her, just present, the way he'd learned to be present in the months since the ambush on the canyon road. She walked through the crowd, and it parted for her the way it had learned to, because they had watched her stand between a sheriff's gun and their children once. And something about that had never fully left them. She climbed onto the platform beside the barrel. Thorne stood there in his shackles, gray-faced, the arrogance finally burned out of him and replaced with something closer to animal fear. The rope hung a few feet from his head. Joe pulled the hunting knife from her belt, the one Cale had given her after the train, and cut the rope down in one motion. The crowd's noise dropped into a stunned, uneven quiet. "What in God's name are you doing?" Someone shouted from the back. She turned to face them. Her hands were steady. She had learned, over the past year, exactly how to make her hands stay steady when everything in her wanted to shake. "I understand what he did to you," she said. Her voice carried clean over the crowd. She'd trained it for years in a classroom, and it served her now. "I buried the water with the rest of you. I watched Elias Drum die in this street, holding a piece of paper he'd learned to read 3 weeks earlier. I do not need a single one of you to explain to me what this man is worth." "Then get out of the way," Hector called. "No," Joe said. She let that sit for a second. "Pull the trigger," she said. "Hang him without a trial, right here, right now, and see what we wake up as tomorrow morning. Because I promise you, it will not be a town that beat Marcus Thorne. It will be a town that became him." He decided which lives were worth less than his profit, and he never once had to answer to anyone for that decision. If we do this, we're telling ourselves the exact same lie, that some lives can be spent without consequence, so long as the cause feels righteous enough while we're spending them. She looked out at faces she knew by name, faces that had sat across plank desks from her, faces that had wept over ledgers their children helped them read. "I am not asking you to forgive him," she said. "I am asking you to be better than him. That is the entire wager we have been making since the day this schoolhouse opened. That the way forward is not more of what he did to us, dressed up in our own hands instead of his." Nobody moved. "We are fighting for our fundamental rights," she said, and her voice cracked on the word fundamental, just slightly, just enough for the crowd to hear that it cost her something to say it, not to become the exact same feral beasts he already is. The silence held. She could hear the wind moving dust down the street. She could hear Thorne breathing hard behind her, could hear the marshals shifting their weight, uncertain whether the moment had turned or was about to turn back. Then Hector lowered the rope in his hand. He didn't say anything. He just let it drop, coiled loosely in the dirt, and after a moment, he turned and walked back toward the crowd. And something in the crowd's posture went with him. One by one, the tension broke. A woman near the front began to cry, quiet and exhausted, and her husband put an arm around her. Eduardo Garza looked at Joe for a long moment, then nodded once, and stepped back from the platform. The marshals moved in and took hold of Thorne's arms and walked him toward the wagon waiting at the end of the street. He didn't look at anyone. He kept his eyes on the ground the whole way, a man who had spent his life believing he was untouchable and had just learned, in the space of a single afternoon, exactly how wrong that belief had been. Joe stood on the platform and watched him go. She felt the adrenaline drain out of her legs all at once, leaving them unsteady. And she was grateful when Cale appeared at the edge of the platform and offered his hand to help her down. "That was either the bravest thing I've seen you do," he said, "or the closest you've come to getting yourself killed by your own neighbors." "Can it be both?" she said. "Generally is, with you." She let him help her down. Her legs were still not entirely reliable. Around them, Blackwood was beginning to exhale, the crowd breaking into smaller clusters, people finding each other, checking on each other. The ordinary business of a town, remembering how to be a town instead of a mob. "They listened," she said half to herself. like she still couldn't quite believe it. They didn't listen, Cale said. They trusted you. There's a difference. She thought about that. About a year of plank desks and painted alphabet tin and adult minors bent over pencils too small for their hands. About the slow, unglamorous work of proving, day after day, that another way was possible before you ever asked anyone to choose it under pressure. I suppose there is, she said. The wagon pulled away down Main Street, carrying Thorne toward whatever federal reckoning waited for him in Red Rock. Behind them, the schoolhouse still stood. The mine still stood. Blackwood, battered and smoke-stained and grieving, still stood. Joe leaned into Cale's side, just for a moment, and let herself feel the ground hold steady under her feet. Tomorrow, she said, I'm teaching class. Figured you might, he said. 6 months is not very long. As a rule, Joe had lived through years that changed less than Blackwood, changed in that half year. And she thought about that often in the quiet moments, usually early in the morning before the children arrived, when the light came low and gold across the valley, and the town looked, for a few minutes, like something out of a painting instead of something that had nearly burned to the ground. Marcus Thorne was in a federal penitentiary outside Denver, convicted on charges that ran 3 pages long when the marshal read them out at trial. Fraud, extortion, conspiracy, attempted murder in the matter of the mine tunnels, and a count of criminal endangerment tied directly to the poisoned wells. Joe had testified. She'd stood in a courtroom that smelled of varnish and cigar smoke and laid out the ledger entries from memory, cold and precise, while Thorne sat at the defense table and would not meet her eyes. The jury took 40 minutes. Judd Boone had not stood trial. He'd disappeared from the territory within a week of the train, his hand ruined beyond any use with a gun again, and the general understanding in town was that he'd gone east, or south, or wherever men went when the badge they'd hidden behind stopped meaning anything. Nobody in Blackwood spent much time wondering. There was too much else to do. The new schoolhouse stood where the old barn had been, though you would not have known it to look at either one. Joe had drawn the plans herself, sitting up 3 nights running with a pencil and a ruler, and half the town had shown up to build it once the lumber arrived. Real windows, a real roof that didn't need patching every time it rained, 2 rooms instead of 1, so the youngest children could learn their letters without the older ones' arithmetic drowning them out. A bell on a post outside, donated by the rail company under new management, that rang every morning at 8 and every afternoon at 3. 41 students now. Joe had lost count of exactly when the number had climbed that high, only that it kept climbing. Families riding in from homesteads, a half day out. Once word got around that the Blackwood school didn't care whose father worked which mine or whose mother spoke which language at home. She was inside sweeping the front room, the morning sun laying long stripes across the floorboards, when she heard boots on the porch steps. She didn't need to turn around to know whose they were. She'd learned the particular weight and rhythm of that stride, the way she'd learned most things about him, slowly and then all at once. You're early, she said, not turning. Boone's cousin came through selling cattle, Cale said, wanted eyes on him before he set up shop at the saloon. And just cattle. She smiled and kept sweeping. The star on his chest caught the light when he crossed into the room, a small bright thing pinned above his heart, where, not so long ago, there had only been a blood-stained past and a reputation that walked into a room ahead of him. The town council had offered him the sheriff's position 2 months after the trial. Joe remembered the meeting, remembered the argument that had run late into the night in the mercantile's back room, old fears about a former outlaw carrying the county's authority, older still about a man from the Harrow gang, wearing a badge in a town that had buried people because of men like that. She had not spoken in his defense. She had thought about it and decided against it, because she understood something about earning things that speaking on his behalf would have undone. Cale had earned it himself. Slowly, a burning building, a canyon ambush, a train in the dark, a gun turned away from a kill shot when a kill shot would have been easier and safer. and entirely justified. The council had voted 7-2. He'd wire the badge crooked the first week, she remembered, still getting used to the weight of it, on a shirt instead of a duster. He didn't wear it crooked anymore. Class starts in 20 minutes, she said. I know, not staying. He leaned against the doorframe, arms loose at his sides, watching her work. Wanted to see it before the noise started. She stopped sweeping and looked at the room properly then, the way she supposed he was looking at it. The desks in even rows, real desks now, shipped up from Red Rock. On credit, the town had finally earned the right to extend. The alphabet on a proper chalkboard instead of painted tin. A shelf of books along the back wall. Some donated. Some bought with money she'd raised writing letters to every literary society and church group east of the Mississippi that would read them. And the children who would fill those desks in 20 minutes. The Garza children. Nora, who read faster now than half the adults in town and had started teaching her mother in the evenings. Tomas, whose family had moved off the company, scrip entirely, once the new mine management started paying real wages, thanks in no small part to a set of ledgers that had once sat in a locked drawer. White children and Shoshone children and the children of Welsh miners and Mexican miners, sharing the same benches, working the same sums. Learning that the alphabet did not care whose house you went home to at night. It's not what I pictured, she admitted, when I first got off that stagecoach. No, Cale agreed. You pictured something smaller. I pictured surviving the first month. She set the broom against the wall. I didn't picture any of this. He crossed the room to her. He still moved like a man who'd spent years learning how to enter a space without being seen doing it. Quiet on the boards even now. Even wearing a badge instead of hiding from one. You built it anyway, he said, pictured or not. She looked up at him. The hard lines of his face had softened somewhat over the months, not into something unrecognizable, but into something easier to read. The eyes were still the same pale gray they'd been the day he came down that canyon wall with 2 smoking revolvers and no interest in explaining himself. But there was less distance behind them now. Less of the man who'd told her, in that same flat voice, that feeling things got people killed. I had help, she said. I mostly just stood in doorways looking threatening. You did more than that, and you know it. He didn't argue the point, which she'd come to understand was as close as he came to agreeing with her outright. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, an unhurried gesture. Nothing like the careful, controlled economy of his earlier movements. He had learned, she thought, to spend motion on things that didn't require it. That, too, felt like a kind of education. Cora's putting together a supper Saturday, he said. Whole town, she says. Some notion about celebrating the schoolhouse, I heard. You going to make a speech? Do I usually? Usually can't stop you. She swatted his arm, and he caught her wrist, gentle, and held it a moment before letting go. Outside, she could hear the first of the children arriving, voices carrying up the road. The particular chaos of small feet, not yet disciplined into the quiet, a classroom, would eventually teach them. She heard Pilar's laugh, high and quick, and somewhere behind the twins, arguing about something that would be forgotten in an hour. You should go, she said. Before they see the sheriff loitering in the schoolhouse and start asking why, let them ask. But he stepped back toward the door anyway, because he understood, the way he'd come to understand most things about her work, that this hour belonged to her and to the 41 children about to fill it, and that his place in the story of Blackwood's schoolhouse was better lived from the doorway than the front of the room. He paused at the threshold. Joe, she looked up. 6 months ago, I told you your ideals would get you killed. I remember. I was wrong about that. He looked out at the children streaming up the path, satchels bouncing, the bell above the door starting to swing under Nora's enthusiastic hand. Seems like they're the only reason any of us are still standing. She didn't have an answer ready for that, which was rare enough that she simply let the moment be what it was. He gave her one last look, unhurried, the kind that had once made her uncomfortable and now felt like being seen clearly by someone who'd earned the right to see her that way. Then he stepped out onto the porch and down into the yard, exchanging a word with Hector's boy on his way, tousling the hair of a girl too young, yet for school, who'd wandered over from the boarding house just to watch the sheriff walk by. Jo turned back to her classroom, rang the bell herself before Nora could beat her to it again, watched 41 children find their seats, some eager, some sleepy, one or two still arguing under their breath about whatever had consumed the walk to school. She picked up the chalk. "Good morning," she said, and the room settled, the way a room settles when it has learned, through long practice, that something worth hearing is about to be said. Today we're going to talk about the Constitution, specifically about a single sentence in it that took this country, the better part of a century, to actually mean. She wrote it across the board in clean, even letters. All men are created equal. She turned back to the class. 41 faces looked back at her, patient, curious, unweighted, yet by all the ways the world would eventually try to convince them the sentence wasn't true. "Who can tell me," she said, "what that word equal is supposed to mean?" Hands went up. She called on Toastmaster first, because he'd been the boy who flinched at a toppled desk once, and now sat with his hand raised before she'd even finished the question. Outside, through the open window, she could see Cale crossing Main Street toward the jailhouse, the badge on his chest catching the morning sun, nodding to a woman he passed, pausing to lift a fallen crate off the boardwalk for an elderly miner without being asked. A town rebuilding itself in small, unremarkable gestures. A man rebuilding himself the same way. She let herself watch him for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was not very long at all. Because there were 41 children waiting on an answer and a country's worth of unfinished promise to explain to them, one lesson at a time. Then she turned back to the board and began. That evening, after the last of the children had gone home, and the schoolhouse sat quiet and gold in the fading light, Cale found her on the porch steps, watching the sun drop behind the western ridge the way she did most evenings now, without particularly meaning to make a habit of it. He sat down beside her, didn't say anything at first, didn't need to. "Long day," he said eventually. "Good day," she said. "There's a difference. I remember you telling me that once. You listen better than you let on." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him. And they sat like that while the sky went from gold to rose to the deep, settled blue that came before the stars. Somewhere down the street, Cora was calling her boy in for supper. Somewhere further off, the mine's evening shift whistle sounded, ordinary and unremarkable, the sound of a town that had, against considerable odds, found its way back to something like peace. 6 months ago, Jo said, "I told you I could wait for a man like Boone to find himself in a world where he couldn't breathe. I remember that too. I didn't think I'd get to see it happen this fast." Cale looked out at the schoolhouse behind them, the new roof catching the day's last light, the bell hanging still on its post. He looked at the town beyond it, imperfect and hard-won, and still standing. "Some things take longer," he said. "Some things you plant, and you don't see grow, but you plant them anyway." "That sounds like something a teacher would say." "Guess I had a good one." She laughed, quiet and real, and tipped her head back against his shoulder and watched the first stars come out over Blackwood. There was no grand speech left to give, no ledger left to hide, no gun left to draw in anger, no rope left to cut down from a crossbeam. Just a town that had chosen, in its hardest hour, to be better than the men who'd tried to break it. Just a schoolhouse full of children who would grow up believing, because they'd been shown rather than told, that the sentence on the chalkboard was something worth building a whole life around. Just two people on a porch at the end of a long road, finally at rest. In the end, the story of Josephine Vance and Cale Cross is not simply a tale about a brave schoolteacher, a dangerous gunslinger, or a small western town fighting against corruption. It is a story about what happens when people refuse to allow their past, their fear, or the cruelty of others to determine who they will become. Jo arrived in Blackwood carrying wounds no one could see clearly. She had escaped a life in which fear had been used to control her. Yet, instead of allowing that fear to make her bitter, she transformed it into purpose. She built a school because she understood that real freedom does not begin with a gun, a badge, or a courtroom. It begins when ordinary people learn to read, to question, to understand their rights, and to recognize their own worth. Kale's journey teaches us a different but equally powerful lesson. A person's past may explain who they were, but it does not have to imprison who they can become. Kale had lived among violent men and carried the scars of both the harm he suffered and the harm he had caused. Yet redemption did not come through one heroic act. It came through hundreds of smaller choices: saving children from a fire, protecting the innocent, lowering his weapon when killing would have been easier, and finally using his strength to serve a community instead of frightening it. His transformation reminds us that redemption is not about erasing the past. It is about taking responsibility for it and choosing differently when the next moment arrives. Blackwood itself also changed because its people learned that justice and revenge are not the same thing. They had every reason to hate Marcus Thorne. He poisoned their water, stole their land, exploited their labor, and destroyed innocent lives. But when they stood beneath that hanging rope, Joe forced them to confront the most difficult question of all. Would defeating a cruel man require them to become cruel themselves by choosing a lawful trial instead of a public execution? The town proved that true justice is not measured by how much pain we can return. It is measured by whether we can stop the cycle of pain without surrendering our humanity. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this story is that lasting change is rarely created by one dramatic victory. It is built slowly, through lessons taught in a wooden schoolhouse, through neighbors protecting one another, through wounded people learning to trust again, and through courage practiced long before the final battle arrives. Joe believed that books could challenge bullets, while Kyle believed that some dangers could only be stopped by force. In the end, both discovered that a better world required wisdom and strength, principle and sacrifice, education and protection. So as we leave Blackwood, remember this: your wounds do not make you weak. Your mistakes do not make you beyond redemption. And your principles are not meaningless, simply because the world is cruel. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not pull the trigger, but choose what kind of person they will be after the smoke clears. And sometimes the greatest legacy we leave behind is not the enemies we defeat, but the people we teach, protect, and inspire to build something better. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and join us for another unforgettable tale from the wild and unforgiving American West. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional, while it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences. It does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.